Okay, this is the third attempt to start recording the second lesson or the second video for lesson one, the introductory lesson. This is week one, so it's going to show up as the title of lesson 1-2. And just one interesting thing, you'll notice I have several toys missing. My daughter just came in and stole a few of the toys off my shelf. But I guess I should go ahead and start the lesson for the book of Revelation. We left off with just discussing some big overview concepts for the book of Revelation, and now we're going to start talking about some of the tools for reading the book of Revelation. If you watched the sermon, then you will already have heard some of these, many of them, but here's just another dive into some of those tools for reading the book of Revelation. First big tool that you need for when you're reading the book of Revelation is that you need to realize the symbolism of the book. The symbolism is a big deal. In fact, it falls under an important rule. One of the rules for reading any communication, interpreting any communication, is context before content. Another one that especially has to do with symbolism, though, is that a text can never mean what it never meant. A text, a communication, a way of talking to someone can never mean what it never meant. This would be like you share some dialogue with someone, you hear what they tell you, and you understand what they tell you. Tomorrow, though, you're going to decide they meant something entirely different, and you're going to get mad at them because their meaning changed in your brain over the course of the day. Now, is that a good way to communicate? Obviously, no. Even though, yeah, our culture kind of does that, as it says, you didn't really mean that, you mean something different instead. But a text can never mean what it never meant. It's a rule of interpretation. So you can't just come up with a new meaning. You have to say, what did that person really mean to say when they said it? And this has to do with the book of Revelation because you have to know what someone meant when they told you the thing the first time around. And we are not the person who heard it the first time around. Instead, we are the much later removed audience of that. Instead, we have to wonder what it meant from the author, who's John, what John meant as well as Jesus, because Jesus is telling John to say these things, what they meant when they communicated it to the original audience. And we can't just make up new meaning for that. It is disingenuous and it is bad communication to assume that they didn't really mean something that could have been interpreted for the original audience, that we have to just come up with something new. Now, there is one small exception to that. There are a few times in the Old Testament when the apostles, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, because they had direct teaching from Jesus, were able to say, yeah, that prophecy way back when, it actually was about this thing nowadays. And if you read it in its context, there's no way you could come up with a new meaning that the apostle gives it. But here's the thing: they get to do that because they're apostles. You and I are not. So if in the future someday God comes down from heaven and says, "Hey Adam, that meaning in the book of Revelation, yeah, guess what? It actually means this now." I'm going to say, "Okay." But until I hear that divine word, I can't do that. And then also, furthermore, it cannot be contradictory because then the voice that I'm hearing can't be God because God doesn't contradict himself. So let's just avoid heresies and avoid those major issues with being disingenuous in how to communicate and just go with whatever it should have meant to the original audience is what I will understand today. And to get that, we have to understand symbolism. And so think of today's sports page and then fast forward in time. If time's going to go another 1,000 years, fast forward in time 1,000 years, and try to imagine what 1,000 years from now how they will interpret the sports pages of today, an ESPN cast. They're going to have no idea what we mean by our mascots. None of the sports stars' names are going to be important anymore after 1,000 years. And so think of political cartoons. Those meanings are going to change drastically over time. I don't understand political cartoons from 100 years ago. Do you? Unless you have a good grasp, and maybe it's one specific cartoon, but I'm talking like a lot of them. And so things, we have to look what it meant back then to understand the real meaning of the political cartoon. And in many ways, especially one of the paragraphs in particular in the book of Revelation, a lot of it is similar communication to a political cartoon. You have to ask how the original readers would have understood these images and metaphors and concepts, how they would have understood what the wild animals meant, what the numbers meant. Now, in the sermon time, we talk about dragons and locusts and eagles and frogs and composite creatures and all those fun things. We'll talk about those as they come up. We also are going to look at 3.5, 7, 12, 1,000. those various numbers. They are important things. They have different symbolism than you and I would give to those things. The handy thing is animals, the symbolism pretty much stays consistent for the most part from culture to culture, for the most part, because animals are animals. Numbers don't stay consistent from culture to culture. Like in American culture, westernized culture, 13 is an unlucky number. Other cultures, it's a different number that is an unlucky number, or it could be a really lucky number. And so that's when we just have to get help for that. Also, with the symbolism included in there is that, remember what I mentioned in the last video, that the average Revelation verse has more than one allusion to the Old Testament. And so we're going to have to ask whether or not the Old Testament context clarifies this part of Revelation that we're studying. And that's going to come up several times, like the Great Battle of Armageddon seems to pull most of its content from one specific passage in Ezekiel. And if it's always referring to the same section of Ezekiel, then maybe we need to figure out what we think of this passage in Ezekiel and how we're going to interpret that. And then maybe if this chunk and this chunk and this chunk and this chunk of Revelation all refer back to the same spot, maybe these aren't different stories. Maybe they're all one story. And so there's different symbolism things that get wrapped up in that conversation. We also have to understand some of the cultural symbols. For example, the sea. So like Revelation chapter 21 has this passage in it. Revelation 21, verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. The sea was no more. Well, that stinks, because I was really hoping that I'd get to sit on a beach and fish in heaven, right? And so, depending on your view, that may not be a happy verse. Heaven may not be that great of a place. So, what do we do with that? But the thing is, ancient readers would have not have thought of the sea as a happy-go-lucky place. Remember how amazed the disciples were when Jesus had command over the sea? That's because in the ancient thought, the sea is where chaos lives. The sea is what God had to subdue to rule over creation. Not that they had a rightful claim to it, but just that chaos is a thing God stops. He's in the way of chaos, and it lives in the sea. That's an ancient thought on this concept. Now, do you need to understand that thought to understand the book of Revelation? No. But if you're going to sit down and start asking, well, what does that phrase, the sea was no more, mean? Then you're going to have to stop thinking in your culture, which thinks beaches and fishing and cruise ships, and you're going to have to think like their culture, where like Leviathan and demons and bad stuff comes out of the sea. For example, like Psalm 77, because one way you can do it is you can look up the sea. You could do a word study on that and then find out other passages that use that word. And so if I want to do, if I can actually remember, maybe I should stop talking in order to look up the passage here. If you want to look up the word the sea, look at different passages in the Bible that bring it up. Here's Psalm 77:16. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters. Yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And that verse, it stops there, but that verse eventually alludes it to, like, this is the Great Sea Crossing. But one of the reasons why the Great Sea Crossing, the Red Sea Crossing, was so great is that it showed that God had dominion over the waters. And the waters is these watery places where bad things are, where chaos happens. And so it's cultural symbolism that is tied up into all of that. All right, so realize the symbolism, and if you don't get the symbolism, that's okay. That's why you need to address the forest for the trees. And so when there are weird symbols in the book of Revelation that you just don't understand, keep reading and read for more of the context, read for more of the emotions, which brings us to our next tool for reading Revelation. The next tool for reading Revelation, there's read with symbolism in mind. The next one is read with emotions in mind. The prophecies in the book of Revelation are meant to stir up feelings. They're meant to paint a picture of how you should feel. So what emotions do the symbols produce in you? Are you afraid? Good. Maybe that means you should figure something out in your life. Are you worried about the things happening in the book of Revelation? Then figure out why you worry. Because God doesn't want you to be anxious about anything. So if you are anxious about the things God's prophesying, either you're interpreting them wrong or you don't have a good heart and a good relationship with God right now. And so you need to figure that out. So if something stirs up emotions in you, you have to figure out why those emotions are happening in the book of Revelation. Because emotions are important in this type of literature that we call apocalyptic literature. You should get excited knowing that there's going to be a battle of Armageddon in which Jesus mops the floor with Satan with just the power of his voice. We should be happy that chaos will end and the sea will be no more. One way to think about how to figure this out is let's ask the question: what do the stars and stripes of an American flag mean? What would how would you describe that to a tribesman on some remote island somewhere? Traveled to some other continent who maybe they've seen the American flag maybe once, or maybe they've never seen an American flag before. How would you describe what the symbols of the stars and stripes mean? And what if you just used the phrase stars and stripes but never used the word flag? People in your culture would know what you mean if you're an American culture and you know what stars and stripes mean. But in another culture, they might go, "What do you mean? You mean those markings on your flag?" And so you have to ask what that mean. And then you have to ask, okay, if I was going to sit down with someone and explain the symbol, would I do it with a history lesson, or would I deal with more simplistic concepts and big picture items for explaining what those symbols mean? Remember, that's maybe how it works cross culturally, even if the aspects of what we have to explain are different. Another big tool for reading the book of Revelation is you have to remember the storyline. The overall storyline is extremely important in the book of Revelation, and the structure of it, the basic structure of it, are things are bad, things get worse, and God saves the day. Like that's the structure of the book. And so the summary of the big picture is here's a summary that I wrote for the book of Revelation. It's: Jesus is the only one worthy to progress God's plan for creation. The plan will be a roller coaster because of evil forces, but those who remain on Jesus' side will overcome evil, inherit Jesus' victory over death, and spend eternity with God in a new creation. I'd like to ask one question dealing with Revelation. It's, the easiest way to get hurt on a roller coaster is to get out of the restraints and jump off. The easiest or the best way to stay safe on a roller coaster is to ride it out until the end. The world is a roller coaster. Yeah, it is. But God let it be designed that way. He let it happen that way. Even though we have kind of broken the restraints on God's ride, He's going to make sure it gets to the end. So hold on and don't jump off. So there's also, you can talk about an outline of the book. There's the introduction, which is chapter 1. There's the letters to the 7 churches, which is chapters 2 and 3. Then we get into God's throne room, with the chapters 4 and 5. Then God reveals some of his plans, and then his plans get revealed in other ways, and Satan fights back, and there's all sorts of weird things with the church, and you get lots of symbolism. But overall, it's God's plans are revealed, and evil resists God's plans. That's roughly chapters 6 to 16-ish. There's a hard break depending on how you want to define it. And then around chapter 14, 15, 16, 17, depending on which perspective you want to take on which thing's more important in those chapters. So it's kind of a slow fade to when God pushes back against evil, fights back against chaos, and saves the day. And then there are chapters 21 and 20, and that's the end. Now that God has saved the day, he's going to enjoy living with this new salvation for everyone that he has saved. You also have to notice that a lot of the stuff happening in like chapters 6 through 16 is in many ways similar to a Hebrew poem. The book of Revelation is not written in Hebrew, it's written in Greek, but it still uses concepts of Hebrew poetry. And Hebrew poetry does not rhyme. Hebrew poetry repeats. That's why a lot of times in the Old Testament you'll see like couplets of verses where it basically says, here's one statement, here's another statement, and both those statements kind of mean the same thing. And so that's called parallelism. So Hebrews don't rhyme words, they rhyme ideas. And so that's how Hebrew poetry works. This also helps us understand how the book of Revelation is not a roadmap for the end times. It's not like supposed to be graphed out on a chart and you make a timeline from chapter 1 to chapter 22 about how the end times works. It literally can't be that way if you read with a good view. You cannot read the entire book of Revelation literally. I know that sounds bad to some of you, but don't worry. I say you should read the entire Bible literally. But Revelation is apocalyptic literature, which means there's going to sometimes be symbols that mean more than what they literally mean. And so, one of the things you notice as you go through the book of Revelation is like stars keep crashing into the earth. That happens a few times, or the earth splits apart. Here's a question: how many times can a star literally crash into Earth before the Earth is destroyed? Yeah, not even once. In fact, if you want to go with a hyper literalistic view, stars can't crash into Earth because Earth is like a speck compared to most stars. And so something has to be going on. It's symbolism, it's imagery. And I notice one of the things as we'll go through the book, what happens quite often is you'll get to the end of time, Judgment Day starts, and that's when you get these images like stars crashing to Earth and all this other craziness happening. And right before you get to the end, oh, never mind, let's back up and repeat this again because it's Hebrew poetry where we repeat ideas over and over again. So we keep getting different perspectives of how we're going to get to the end of time. I hope that makes sense. I think it'll make a lot more sense as we actually finally get to the book, which does start next week. We'll be in chapter 1 next week. This will be the last teaching video for this week, but many weeks we'll have 3 videos potentially because I want to shoot for less than 15-minute videos. And I don't have a counter right there. We've been going 16 minutes. I do have a counter. And so I want to shoot for lesser videos than this so you can digest them in smaller chunks. All right, that's the tools for reading the book of Revelation. So remember the symbolism, remember the emotions and sensationalism, and then remember the structure. So I guess we can go with 3 S's: symbolism, sensationalism, and structure. All right, so here are the discussion questions for this week, this video. You already had some earlier in this week. But I'd like you to read Revelation chapter 22, verses 1 through 5, and read it with questions thinking about what I talked about in this video. Look for the feelings and emotions that come out of it. Look for the symbols that come out of it. Look for where it fits in God's overall timeline for the world. I do not want you to ask questions like, well, how can crystals be bright? Or, are there really only 12 kinds of fruit in heaven? Or, how on earth are there trees that produce 12 kinds of fruit? Or, am I really going to have God's name tattooed on my forehead? If you are asking those questions, you are asking the wrong questions. Read with symbols in mind. What do these symbols mean? Read with emotions and sensations in mind. What feelings do I have as I read this passage? And read with the structure in mind. Where am I at in the story of God's timeline? And how should that make me feel? What should I be prepared for? What should I be ready for? And so, are there metaphors that you sometimes miss? Do you have trouble with metaphors? There are metaphors in that passage. Just think about metaphors for a little bit. What symbols would it be easy for me to miss in another culture? It's going to be really hard to ask. So instead, what are symbols that I just take for granted that other people may not recognize? And when it comes to the book of Revelation, remember, there are a lot of symbols. And so we're going to talk about those as we go through the book together. Thank you for joining me for this next video.